Welcome to our fifth and our final Politics Forum event of the semester. For those of you who are new to the College of New Jersey or new to Politics Forum programming, the Politics Forum is sponsored by the Department of Political Science. It's a forum for the presentation of analytical and/or empirical research concerning political power, institutions, and choices. We welcome presentations by faculty from across the social sciences and the humanities whose research bears on these matters. Again, this is the final such event for this semester. We'll have a new schedule by the beginning, hopefully by the beginning of our spring semester. Once again, we'll have a mixture, as usual, I should say, we'll have a mixture of speakers from the College of New Jersey and from other institutions. Today's speaker is Professor Jonathan Collins. Dr. Collins is an assistant professor of education at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. His research interests center on questions of racial and ethnic minority political behavior, democratic governance, local and urban politics, and public policy, particularly education policy. Dr. Collins has written on race, empirical approaches to democratic theory, education finance, urban school reform, urban school governance, African-American voting behavior, childcare policy, political attitudes toward climate change, and more. His research has been published in many peer-reviewed scholarly journals, including Political Behavior, the Journal of Urban Affairs, Local Government Studies, and the Harvard Journal of African American Policy. His public commentary has been published in the Washington Post and Education Week, and he also provides regular television commentary on Basic Black through WGBH in New England. His talk today is entitled Education, Democracy, and Racial Justice During the COVID-19 Period. We're very happy to have him here today, and I will turn the floor over to him for his talk, and then we will proceed to have some discussion, I hope. So over to you, Jonathan.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everybody from the College of New Jersey for having me. Thank you, Professor Touloudis. Thank you, Professor Bowen. Thank you, everyone, for just being a part of this discussion. And I really wanted to be a discussion. What I'm going to do is just kind of spend some time talking about kind of some more recent research that I've been fielding over the past few months, some recent results, kind of put things on the table and open things up for questions. And I'm hoping that we can have a pretty interesting dialogue. I'm extremely excited about just kind of how you all are going to receive this work. So what I'll be talking about, here's just a basic overview. I'll give background on the competing theories of the politics of education. I'll kind of insert what I'm loosely calling the COVID-19 dilemma. And then I'll discuss two studies. One study that I'm sort of farther along with that I actually conducted right before the pandemic started. And then I'll go into a second study that I fielded actually during the pandemic, talk about the results and go into the Q&A. And so I always like to start with this quote in particular from John Dewey, and understanding why it's important to think about questions of education politics, which is just this idea that education is a social process, education is growth, education is not preparation for life, but life in and of itself. Right? So when we think about what we ultimately want out of our education system, it's important that we push toward this process that we understand is central to life and social life. It also makes us understand why we're actually sort of solving this question of how to make schools more equitable is a really, really big challenge because it's social in nature, it's political in nature. And so, what I'm really been interested in with my work are, what are the big kind of questions facing the politics of education on that political side? And if you look at the literature, you'll find what I think are sort of three big problems, and then there's this kind of zeitgeist. Right, the three big problems are going to be the federalism problem, which is who should be in charge over schools? Should it be the federal government? Should it be states? Should it be school districts? Should it be schools themselves? Right. There's the politicization of education. Is education immune to partisan politics? Right. Education is one of those areas where you've seen, at least especially in terms of federal policymaking, quite a huge amount of bipartisan cooperation here, right, which suggests that it might actually be immune to some of the politics. But then when you start to look at education across different dimensions, you kind of see the evidence under which, well, the politics really does sort of trickle in there. And then the racialization of education. Is education really an issue area for advancing society towards racial equity? Like, this is kind of the fundamental sort of question with education. We see so much racial and economic inequity in the history of our education system and like how our schools have sort of come to become what they are today. But then there's this optimism that schools could also be this mechanism through which we actually reverse, sort of right some of our wrongs. So thinking about the racialization of education is an important idea here. And then there's this sort of zeitgeist, which is the COVID-19 problem. And this just kind of throws a wrench in everything. You know, how do schools operate? And the thing that I'm particularly asking questions about is how do we have sort of actual, parent and community engagement during this crisis? And, how do we actually make decisions around opening and closing of schools and in implementing safety precautions democratically during this period of time? And again, so just to give a little bit more background, there's the federalism problem, this idea that education governance is unsystematically layered. And I think about the marble cake, where it's hard to really tell, who's on which is on top and which is on bottom. Think about local government and state government and federal government almost kind of resembling the marble cake. The politicization of education, and this happens on multiple levels. You have competition between states that differ in terms of their political sort of their political leaning. You have the over influence of political groups and special interests, the influence of political ideology just on a kind of individual level. And then there's the influence of partisan politics. What happens when we have this kind of pendulum swinging of party control at the state and local level and federal level? There's the racialization. This is government interventions or the lack thereof as guise for or a tool for race-based targeting. So, this is the idea that, we've had government interventions that have been aimed towards solving problems of racial equity. We've had government interventions that are completely aloof of the need for racial equity, right? And people have been writing about sort of both of these things and how do we reconcile them. And then there's this different area that I really feel like I'm sort of writing in, and I feel like this is my kind of like more conceptual and empirical and theoretical home, which is the democratization of education. Elections as accountability mechanisms, but then also thinking about the utility of democratic innovations at the local level. And the latter is really where I'm writing. How can efforts at democratic innovation really be useful for school improvement? And then there's this COVID-19 problem that we're all trying to make some sense of. And so here, there's the literature is still emerging, and this is across fields. Like, we really don't even know, the long-term impacts of COVID-19. We're still sort of collecting data and speculating. This raises concerns about the opening and closing of schools, right? When do we open schools? When do we close them? Do we do hybrid models? All of these questions are swirling. Questions about public health protocol, ventilators in schools, social distancing in classrooms, isolation rooms for students who experience symptoms. We also have concerns about the impact on student learning and potential racial and economic disparities. This is also a double-edged sword. Are we going to see bigger disparities if we do totally remote, and then students, racial and ethnic minorities and low-income students are doing worse when it comes to remote learning? Or do we go with in-person models with these restrictions and we still expect these disparities to mount? So again, like, we don't even know which style or which method is going to be even better or worse for reducing disparities at this point. And then all of this is intersecting with everything that happened during the summer with racial injustice and the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests. So you have a lingering question about the politics of education. And then you also have this really, really huge and relatively unprecedented like social movement that was happening over the summer. And all of these things are happening at once. And so this is just, a table that I rely on just to kind of synthesize and make sense of kind of what these sort of different competing theories are supposed to sort of do and how we operationalize them and what are some of the outcomes. And I'm particularly interested in how they interact with the zeitgeist, which is going to be the COVID-19 issue. And, and again, I'm interested in, when we're thinking about the politics of education, what role do these sort of democratic innovations really, really play here? And when we're thinking about democratic innovation or really democratizing education, you're thinking about citizen and stakeholder input. This is the bottom box on the far left. You're thinking about public transparency, proxies for this, how do we identify it, measure it, voter turnout, public meeting attendance, and then just the overall availability of information, outcomes associated, changes in political participation, changes in political representation, changes in views towards government, and then participation in decision-making, trusting government to handle these crises. This is the thing that should really be sort of somewhat disparately impacted by the COVID-19 dilemma. So one, do these democratic innovations actually work in terms of making people trust their school boards more, trust their local schools more? Are they more willing to participate in these kinds of political spaces more when there is democratic innovation? And then when it comes to the COVID-19 thing, it's like, well, does this actually sort of decrease the propensity to participate, or does it alter the propensity to participate? And does this does this change the way in which we look at our officials, because of now we're relying on this additional factor of we have to trust whether or not we think that they're handling the crisis appropriately. And so this is just sort of one line of thought that I think is intersecting with some of these other mechanisms that I actually have on the table. So it's really to get us to think about, like, no, there isn't just sort of one answer to what's happening in terms of the politics of education. What you're going to see from the evidence is that, all of these mechanisms kind of tell a little bit part of the story. And so to sort of set the table for, for the COVID-19 sort of data collection effort, this is a study that I organized right before the pandemic started. Literally, I collected this data probably about a week before our University Brown went on a complete shutdown, and COVID became a really big thing. And so the idea here is like this school board meeting style matter. And the way I'm framing this is we have about 13,000 school districts in the US. The vast majority are run by school boards. School boards typically have these responsibilities: approving personnel assignments, approving labor contracts, weighing in on disciplinary matters, ensuring that the district is in line with state and federal standards. And they typically hold these meetings monthly where they perform these duties, right? So these are opportunities for like direct citizen participation, even though like it's a school board meeting. Most people don't go, they're boring, they're long and drawn out. Well, the idea in the study is, well, what would happen if we actually restructure them to be more engaging? Would this actually sort of change the way that people view school board meetings, and whether or not we think school boards should be in control of schools if they were just structured to be more engaging and more inviting? Now, but in the literature, there's reasons to be suspicious of school boards, right? Low voter participation in the elections, vulnerability to the influence of special interests, over-influence of large donors. So a sizable number of scholars in political science have kind of really written school boards off as these potential sites for democracy. They really kind of see them as what I'm calling illusions of democracy. But then it has been this like evidence sort of competing, suggesting that school boards provide a mechanism for holding schools accountable. They are in urban districts that provide opportunities for empowerment. And then they also serve as what I've been showing in work leading up to this, along with some other folks, Bob Asen, is that they also offer these opportunities for direct citizen participation, and that's kind of useful. And so what I'm doing here is I'm borrowing from this kind of larger research on sort of democratizing institutions, especially work on participatory democracy and deliberation, right? And in this work, these are studies of direct citizen participation that are included but not limited to highlight increase in political knowledge, increase in trust in institutions, and increases in future civic participation. And what these studies typically do is they use these like isolated, structured deliberation events, right? Where people are recruited, they come to participate in these large forums. They're assigned to sit at tables and engage in these deliberative conversations with random people in small groups. And then we see, do they learn more about political issues from these discussions? Do they become more trusting of institutions when institutions foster these kinds of events? And do they become more likely to participate in politics in the future as a result of being a part of these forums where they get to discuss public political issues, exchange viewpoints, share their opinions, and really like engage in political dialogue? And what I've been trying to do is to just see, well, to what extent can we measure the extent to which this would be useful, just from a broad norms perspective, if implemented and institutionalized in the school board meeting setting. And so the research question driving this initial project is, what is the effect of exposure to democratic school board environments in which school boards are actively engaging in dialogue with the public, right? And so the ideal design would be to randomly assign people to attend different school board meetings that vary in their sort of level of engagement, right? And then and then have school board members who are on board and sort of play the role of being on board with this quote unquote manipulation. That's a really difficult thing to do. So what I decided instead was to sort of take advantage of a technological opportunity. And what I found was there was a school board in Southern California that actually instituted direct response to to public comment in their school board meeting structure. And I took video clips of a video clip from their school board meeting and compared it with video clips from another board meeting another school board that doesn't do this. And I essentially sort of measure the difference of being exposed to a school board that just decides, you know what, when people give public comment, we're going to give them a direct response. We're going to give them something that sort of resembles this idea of public deliberation and public dialogue. And so I filled a survey online through Amazon Turk, over 2,200 respondents. Again, this is late February. Includes the oversample of people of color and then low income folks, because I'm really interested in the people that the political science literature is telling me they don't attend school board meetings, they don't attend public meetings, period. They're not as active and engaged in local politics. And I really want to see how they respond to being exposed to these institutions that are just more engaging and more inviting. And so in this study, there are 3 different treatment groups. There's a group that got a school board meeting where there was no public participation, so no one showed up to give public comment, or it was participation where there was public comment but no response from the board. And then the third treatment is the deliberation treatment, where there is public comment and direct response from the board on that actual comment. And so here's just an illustration of what was happening with the 3 different treatment groups. Again, so 1 and 2 are the exact same school boards. They have, and then they're also talking about the same agenda item same agenda issue, which is teacher salaries. So in the first meeting, the issue is teacher salaries. Nobody shows up to give public comment. The second treatment, still teacher salaries in the same district. Teachers actually show up to give comment, but the board says nothing in response. And then the third treatment is a different school board meeting that embeds this response to public comment. And here, teachers come and give public comment, but then the school board, the superintendent and the school board president actually give a direct response to the teachers. And so the dependent variables in the study, I'm asking pre and post treatment about trust in school boards and who they believe should be in charge of school boards. And then post treatment, I'm asking about willingness to attend school board meetings and willingness to raise a concern at a meeting. Are you willing to work with the board to solve a problem? Like, are you really sort of empowered and activated by seeing this school board engage in kind of quote unquote public deliberation with members of the public? Excuse me. And then just some key control variables just to make sure that if the treatment is successful, it's not being a function of some of these other things that might be happening sort of psychologically in the respondents' heads. Perceptions of dialogue in their own district. Excuse me. They just think that they're used to school boards being discursive. So when they see it, that's what's driving it. They're satisfied with their own schools. They just like schools and school boards themselves. And if you show them a school board, they're on board. Self-reported school board meeting attendance, just people who just are already familiar with the process. So maybe they're immune to the treatment or maybe more susceptible to the treatment. Their own community involvement, school involvement, race, gender, income, all these things that might have some sort of effect. And so even controlling for these things, the results came out pretty consistent with what I expected, sort of theoretically. The people who got the no participation school board meeting, your typical school board meeting where like nobody really shows up and the school board doesn't actually have any kind of like interaction with the public. The people who got that treatment were significantly less likely to express trust in the board versus the people that got the participation treatment and the deliberation treatment, both and respectively, were more likely to express trust in their school board when they just saw that public participation and or if they saw that participation with deliberation. When it came to willingness to attend the meeting, the people who got that deliberation treatment, where there's participation and direct response, they were more likely to say that they would be willing to attend a meeting in the future compared to people who got the participation treatment or the no participation treatment. What's a study without no results, right? And so while they were more willing to attend a meeting in the future, while trust was going up, the actual action-oriented items, you see no statistically significant difference here, no statistical significance in the estimated differences here. So when it came to actually raising a concern at a meeting and actually working with the board to raise it, to address a community problem, I saw relatively no results here. When it came to the idea of legitimacy, though, the people who got the deliberation treatment were more likely to believe that school boards should be in charge of schools. And this is compared to the State Board of Education. This is compared to mayoral control, the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education being in control, and even local school site councils, right? The school board was more likely, there was a stronger preference for school boards being in charge when they were presented with this deliberation treatment. And so the summary from study one, school boards are potential sites for local democracy. One advantage in particular is the opportunity for citizens to engage directly with public officials. We know that direct engagement matters, but we know less about the impact of exposure to engagement, right? We know what happens when people, especially in the deliberation and participatory democracy literature, we know what happens when people are actually recruited and they attend these kind of events. But what happens when people are just exposed to a setting when there is participation and deliberation, when they just see it happening? We don't really know about this exposure. I find evidence that exposure to more engaging school board meetings increases trust in school boards, willingness to attend school board meetings in the future, and the likelihood of deciding the school board should be in charge of policy. But the exposure may be less useful for generating action-based participation. And this is particularly important given to the sample, because remember, half of my sample are folks of color. And almost half of my sample are folks who are in households where the household income is less than 50,000. All right, so these are the people that, again, the literature is saying they don't really participate in politics, especially local politics, at high rates. And while it's doing work on the trust and willingness to attend, and the lack of action-based participation is still somewhat concerning. Second study. How am I doing on time? Just reminding you about these competing theories. Right. But what I'm doing here is I'm fielding now a national survey. This is during the COVID pandemic. And again, the oversample for BIPOC. So I'm looking at folks for Black, Indigenous, folks of color, and then I'm also looking at folks in low-income households. Again, the sample here is smaller, but it's actually a more representative sample just with an oversample appended. So like I'm raising the overall sort of sample size with this oversample, but at root it's a nationally representative sample. So it's actually even more sort of informative, you could say, than the previous sort of MTREC sample. And this is also done through Lucid. So just a better recruitment mechanism that they have. But you can see the racial and ethnic breakdown here and the income breakdown here. And again, when it was fielded late July, early August. And I kind of went a little crazy here and wanted to really test sort of multiple theories through these kind of different sort of experimental designs here. So I'm going to throw a lot at you over the next few minutes, and you're just going to have to bear with me. And I promise you, it makes some sense, right? And so I have a federalism test where I'm testing for this idea of like, remember I talked about the federalism problem. Who should be in charge? So I randomly assigned this hypothetical about compliance with stay-home orders or with school reopening orders. What happens when you're assigned, when the conversation is around whether or not schools should reopen in person, and the message comes from the mayor versus the governor versus the president of the United States. A democratization test where I'm randomly assigning school board meetings that vary in structure. So the study one that I just showed you, basically I take this idea and create meeting flyers for school board meetings. And here, instead of just the engagement versus non-engagement, I add this additional dimension, which is online versus in person, right? To sort of get at the sort of zeitgeist, the COVID problem. So not only am I measuring whether or not people are responding to the opportunity to attend a virtual, attend a meeting that is more deliberative versus just informative. I'm also measuring whether or not they're more receptive to the online Zoom meeting versus the in-person with COVID restrictions. And then I'm also randomly assigning the idea of decision making being either done by local officials or being the result of direct vote. So I wanted to see if people wanted to have more of a direct say in terms of these decisions around schools reopening, if we really wanted to sort of like directly democratize it. And then what I'll end on are, these, what I'm calling racialization tests here. And this is centering around the idea of defunding the police, because this became a particularly salient policy issue, given the racial injustice protests during the summer. And then this idea of anti-racist teaching, of anti-racist curricula, especially in history. And what I'm doing is I'm adding manipulations to both, and I'll talk a little bit more about those, but really trying to see how durable the support is for both of those policy issues, defunding the police, and then support for anti-racist teaching curriculum. And key control variables here: level of exposure to COVID-19. So this was if someone on a scale of whether you personally contracted the virus, whether someone in your household contracted the virus, whether you know someone outside your household who has contracted the virus, whether you have a family member outside your household that has contracted the virus, or you know no one at all who has actually contracted the virus. And then your trust in the reporting of the news, which a lot of surveys have shown has really gone down over the course of the last 4 years. And so, I thought this was a very important thing to measure: partisanship, ideology, racialization, their own sort of racial identification. And then these other factors: parental status, school satisfaction, satisfaction with district leaders, gender, age, income. And so outcome one, this idea of reopening schools. So what I did was I actually asked an open-ended question about schools reopening, right? And so I asked the respondents using one sentence to provide your thoughts on whether schools should reopen during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wanted to do an open-ended question as opposed to a closed-ended kind of Likert scale response question, is because I really genuinely was curious at the time. Like, I wanted to know like what kind of things people would say, how they were feeling about schools reopening at that time. And there was some nuance that I got from the responses that I know I wouldn't have gotten if I had asked it closed-ended. So for instance, people would talk about family members who are teachers, and they're concerned about, like a daughter or a son who's a teacher and would be entering the classroom. People would speak about their kids and how they're concerned about their kids and from both sides, concerned about their kids contracting the virus, concerned about kids not being able to see their friends and have social interaction. You have some people who were believing a lot of misinformation, so that was important. You have people who were actually really, really adamant about following public safety protocol. So it was really a cool way to see how people were responding politically in that moment. And so then what I do is then I sort of categorize and mention responses just to see, okay, well, like how do we make sense of this and what's the variation? And to find out which factors seem to be predicting who supports the decision to reopen versus who opposes it, right? Or in this case, how I'm coding it, the people who don't want schools to reopen versus the people who do want schools to reopen. And what I'm showing you here is that, again, remember, all of these different narratives that I have circulating at the beginning, there's evidence that, that multiple stories are telling us about what's happening here. And so in terms of preferences that schools remain closed, which were the largest the most important factors here, the political factors played a big role. Democrats were more likely to prefer the schools remain closed. Political conservatives were more likely to suggest that schools actually open. Racial and ethnic minorities were more likely to express the preference that schools remain closed. So again, the racialization dimension as well as the political dimension are playing somewhat of a role here. And then the folks who trust the news are more likely to express preferences that schools remain closed. And this is an important thing to be thinking about now as we start to have those conversations again around schools reopening. Compliance with schools reopening. This is the thing that I was really interested in, because now we're seeing it, right? We're seeing it happen in real time, right? Now governors are coming out and trying to figure out whether or not they want to make decisions around school reopenings or keep the decisions down to city level leaders. And then we're in the midst of a presidential transition where now we have questions of whether or not the new president of the United States will step in and try to enforce some sort of compliance order. And so in this experiment, I provide them with this vignette, right? There's uncertainty around whether public schools should reopen at all before the COVID-19 vaccine is produced. However, if the number of cases does not increase significantly over the next few months, schools may be ordered to reopen. Indicate whether you agree or disagree with the next statement. If the mayor of my city versus the governor of my state versus the president of the United States, again through random assignment, eventually orders the schools open, I will comply with that order. And the big takeaway here is on the far left, which is that the folks who got the president treatment were just significantly less likely to say that they would comply. You saw people were on average a little bit more likely to comply if the message comes from the governor relative to the mayor. But the big difference is between the POTUS and kind of everybody else. And again, extremely political here. Democrats were less likely to comply, period. Political conservatives were more willing to comply, sort of period, regardless of which group they were assigned to. And racial and ethnic minorities were less likely to comply, period, again, regardless of assignment. And this is just kind of showing you the same results, but just with a little bit more clarity here. So you can see people who got the president message are about 10 percentage points less likely to say that they would comply with that order. Elite driven versus a public decision on schools reopening. So what I wanted to do here is assess how people would respond to the idea that the decision on reopening be made truly democratically by just like a direct vote from the public versus trusting school district leaders to come together and make a decision on opening or on reopening or not. And we saw more of the school leaders coming together and making decisions. And we also saw a lot of public criticism of that process through which they underwent to make those decisions. So I thought, well, what would happen if people were presented with this idea of the public just making the decision themselves? And the people who got the direct vote treatment were just more likely to be okay with this process of reopening schools. And this is kind of sort of the big takeaway here is that direct vote treatment triggered a lot more support for this idea of schools reopening than the people who got the school district officials treatment. So they're about 10 percentage points more likely to support this idea, this process, when there's a direct vote as opposed to the process the decision being made by district leaders. There was a hidden racial element here though, and this is just plots to show you the results of what I just showed you in that regression table. But so there was a hidden racial element here. And when I looked more closely into the data, I just kind of looked at raw differences and averages, and I kept seeing that African Americans were more supportive in the direct vote treatment group, but it wasn't coming through in the regression model. So what I went and did is, as a robustness check, I went and ran an interaction. And when you interact the treatment variable with respondents who identified as Black in the survey, it really comes out. So the Black respondents who got the direct vote treatment, they were 24 percentage points more likely to support the process when there's a direct vote. And again, when you control for these things, the actual sort of overall support for this process amongst folks who are non-Black and were assigned to the control group, the school officials, they were only 6%, 6 percentage points likely to support that process. You see the opposite happening with the white respondents, right? And so again, the interaction here should say white, sorry about that. But the interaction here is showing you that white respondents were actually about 16 percentage points less likely to support the decision when they were in the direct vote treatment group. And here's a graph that just kind of illustrates that all sort of put together, right? So Black respondents who got the direct vote treatment, versus respondents of color. This includes the Black respondents who got the direct vote treatment, more supportive of this process. The white respondents were 16 percentage points less likely to support this process when they were assigned to the direct vote treatment group. And then you can see the full sample, about 10 percentage points more likely, just comparison between direct treatment versus school official decision. I told you I was throwing a lot at you. I warned you, right? And so here's the school board meeting flyer experiment, right? And the idea here, again, I showed you this previous study where I tested the effect of exposure to the more engaging school board meetings. And now, again, I'm adding this dimension of engaging versus informative versus purely informative. And then I'm also adding, again, this dimension of in-person with COVID-19 restrictions, because it had to be believable, versus a total Zoom meeting. So I'm showing you the 4 different flyers that were sort of possible for people to see. And again, I'm just randomly assigning them to people. And so post-treatment measures, I'm asking about trust in school boards, willingness to attend school board meetings, comfort raising a concern, and then what external political efficacy, the belief in their ability to impact policy decision-making. And then, so here's the trust in boards. I'll show you this one because it better sort of, it's a clear illustration of what's happening here. And trust in boards is going up. It's not a huge effect. It's about 5 percentage points more likely to express trust in school boards if you were shown the deliberation virtual treatment. So the school board meeting where there is open dialogue, but it's also online via Zoom, versus the informative, but also virtual meeting. So there is no public dialogue. The school board is just there to inform you on what's happening, what the district is going to do, but we're also doing this via Zoom compared to the deliberation in-person meeting where there was a null effect. And all of this is relative to the kind of baseline measure, which is for the deliberation, which is the informative in person. So compared to the informative in person, people were more trusting the school boards if they got the deliberation virtual, the informative virtual, but not really compared to the folks who got the deliberation in person. Willingness to attend school board meetings, and as you can see, again, just for the precision here, this is where you see probably the largest effects here, which I thought was really important. So the people who got the deliberation, the more engaged virtual meeting, were almost 20 percentage points more likely to say that they would attend a meeting in the future. And it's about 16 percentage points for the people who got the virtual meeting that was informative. And then only about maybe 4 or 5 percentage points more likely to attend a meeting if it's engaging, but it's in person, right? So the sample overall is really responsive to the COVID, the need for COVID precautions and willing to engage virtually, which I thought was kind of an important takeaway for us to understand when we're thinking about the nature of civic engagement during this COVID-19 period, that it is actually possible to do some of these things online, and the engagement online element adds a very important piece. Similar thing with raising a concern, still a decent effect here. And this is the effect that I actually wasn't getting from the previous study. So, this is, kind of important here. People were more likely to raise a concern about a school board meeting. I think personally that it's this new, again, the zeitgeist, the COVID effect, that makes people more interested and willing to raise a concern now at a school board meeting, just because I think the stakes of COVID have just, made people more comfortable with that idea. Because again, wasn't seeing this in the previous study, now I am, but it's still a small effect here, about 5 percentage points. And in terms of efficacy, not really any different effect, not really any sort of meaningful effects here when it comes to external political efficacy. So they didn't necessarily believe that they could actually impact policy decision-making anymore from seeing these different types of school board meeting opportunities. But what we did see is increases in willingness to attend school board meeting, trust in school boards, willingness to attend, and willingness to raise a concern. So we're making progress. Now, again, all of this is happening with racial justice in the background, in the forefront, really both. And so, one of the big issues that emerged was this notion of defunding the police. And kind of going back to, sort of this Dewey notion of education and what it's supposed to be, and really thinking about how, again, like the history of education, politics, and policy has been, well, can education really be that great equalizer? Can we use education to really like further educational equality? You think about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of '65. This was a major intervention in terms of trying to promote racial and economic inequality. Well, racial equality through economic equality, but really racial and economic equality. And education policy has been a space where you can talk more openly about racial equality, arguably, than you can in a lot of other policy spaces. So there's real reason to suspect that something like defunding the police or some of these policies that are coming out related to policing reform would essentially benefit from being framed around advancing education. And so what I'm doing here in this treatment is asking essentially whether or not respondents will be more likely to support or support defunding the police if it meant more money for schools, right? And so this is the difference between the two treatment groups. One, do you support defunding the police and drastically reducing the police budget? B, would you support it if it meant more money for local public schools? And the evidence suggests that it really wasn't. Again, some of these other things are playing a role: ideology, younger folks were oddly sort of less likely to support it. But it was controlling for party, and a lot of it got soaked up by partisanship. But here's the sort of main finding here, which is that the folks who got the school's treatment were about 10 percentage points more likely. Small effect here. The biggest thing is whether or not you supported the protest. If you supported the protest, this was the leading predictor of whether or not you supported defunding the police. And the school's treatment added an additional bump to the effectiveness of just that measure in and of itself. So the folks who really supported, again, the people who really supported the protests, again, this is also interacting with age, really supporting the protests, were more likely to support defunding the police. And then the people who got the school's treatment, the money would go to schools, got this additional bump and expressed this additional bump in support. Again, this is just to show you on the left, I'm showing you both of the major sort of factors I'm looking at. And then on the right, I'm just really zooming in on that school's treatment. And then opposition or support for anti-racist curriculum. And again, so the big thing, one of the big things that came out of the debate around anti-racist teaching was whether or not there would be support for anti-racist teaching, given that there might be parents who don't consent to this. There might be parents who would not be okay with sending their kid to school, and now the history curriculum is centered around teaching about the history of racism. And so what I really wanted to know is how people were responding to this idea of, whether or not consent is on the table. What happens if you have to make this consideration for supporting anti-racist teaching, even if it comes with this caveat that that we're going to do it regardless of whether parents actually consent to being okay with this. And what I found actually was a null effect here. And sometimes null effects can be really, really cool and informative. And I think this is one of those cases, right? So again, support for the protests is again the strongest predictor, and in the consent treatment had virtually no effect whatsoever on the respondents. So even if they were presented with this idea that this curriculum would be implemented without the consent of parents, they were still just as likely to support it. Again, the support or opposition ultimately came down to whether or not they supported the protests that were happening over the summer. And so, in summary, during the COVID-19 period, I find evidence that views toward the reopening of schools are shaped by a combination of the federalism problem and the influence of partisan politics. Democratic interventions intersecting with the COVID-19 precautions yields promise for increasing public engagement. And again, with this oversample of racial and ethnic minorities, of people of color, and folks in low-income households, it really, I think, augments the importance of these findings here. Is that equally receptive to these democratic interventions. And these are the folks that the literature, again, has been telling us aren't really receptive to these kinds of things. And then lastly, education does not seem to be an issue area. Education, excuse me, does seem to be an issue area where movement can be made on racial justice policies during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, remaining questions, and then open this up for dialogue with you all. But when it comes to the intersection of the competing models, is this just the tip of the iceberg? You're thinking about the federalism problem and the parties, the political problem and the democratization problem. Are we just getting started in terms of thinking about how all these narratives intersect together? Excuse me. And what are the implications for student learning and achievement, right? If I'm providing evidence here that there is a hunger for parent and community engagement, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, what are the implications for being able to do this well, parent and student engagement and community engagement well, in a way that lends itself to student learning and increased student achievement? And then again, what are the long-term effects, both positive and negative, on the politics of education that might develop as a result of COVID-19? What is this going to mean for education politics, again, on the positive end? And what is it going to mean for the politics of education on the negative end? Are the way in which our institutions structured going to look differently now? Is engagement going to look differently now? Is the question of who should be in charge of schools going to look differently now? And is that going to be, is the answer to that question going to be good or bad? And
Thank you, Jonathan. Wonderful. I invite everybody to come in with questions. There are plenty of ways to participate. You can use the chat function, the Q&A function. You should also feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak up that way. And I'll be sort of trying to moderate here a little bit. Looks like we already have one question here in the Zoom chat. Let's just start with this one. Question from Donald Fleck. Question regarding people more likely to attend a virtual meeting and/or raise an issue. I wonder if there's a basic feeling of security when at home that might lead the parent to feel more safe in raising an issue. Also, with virtual meetings, maybe there can be more attendance among low-income people who are very busy, much easier to find time to attend from home.
Yeah, so Donald, I think your intuition is spot on. And so there were questions, even when I was constructing the design, there were questions around, whether or not the results would come out the way that they came out, because, how do we know that low income folks have internet access? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not myself poor, but I know quite a few people who are poor and still have quite a bit amount of internet access. And I think you would see what we saw, which was that, look, this opportunity to participate in kind of a low cost, low stakes way is going to be received very well. Now, all of a sudden, you don't have to drive all the way across the city to a district office. Like, look, you can just log on to Zoom and have access to your school board as they're giving pertinent information, as they're involving you in conversations that have, really, really high stakes, life or death matters. And the evidence sort of was bearing that out. And so I think your intuition is spot on. The security thing I think is really interesting. And that's something I can think about trying to incorporate into the replication as I refill this survey to try to see kind of where we are now at this point of the pandemic. So thank you for that.
One more implication might be that they consider continuing virtual meetings after the pandemic is over.
Exactly. I'm really curious to see, if that's the case, because technologically, the conditions have already been being established. This is why in the first experiment, I'm able to do what I do in that initial one, is because school boards have already been recording their meetings and making them available online. They've already been engaging in this kind of web streaming. We just haven't completely resorted to the Zoom-based meetings where there's just total online attendance and interaction. But then now that we've gotten a little taste of it, I expect it to be at least an option sort of moving forward. And so I really hope that we see this. And maybe this evidence could be something that can convince more school boards who have the ability to do that, to maybe take on that initiative.
Great. Looks like we have a hand raised. Cadence.
Hi, Jonathan. So great to learn more about what you've been working on recently. Super interesting set of experiments, and really excited to learn how you continue to push this work forward. I had a question about your, it was this chart that looked at demographic differentials in deliberative decision-making, and how people felt about the COVID-19 reopenings and closings. And I was wondering why if you could talk a little bit more about why you thought there were these gaps between respondents of color and white respondents, because I would assume that all people would feel more included by this deliberative decision-making process. And I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the treatments when you're exposing people to this kind of deliberative school board style. So was there any kind of descriptive representation on the school boards, or were they pretty homogenous? Could you see the people who are on the school board? I'm just wondering what effect that might have had in respondents' perceptions of the sort of deliberative process.
Wow, great questions. First, Kate is great to be able to interact with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's so great to hear your voice. We miss you.
I know. I miss Providence too. I hope you're all doing well.
We are. I'll tell everybody that you said hi.
Well, please do.
Yeah. And as far as your questions, so why I think especially the direct vote treatment got experienced these racial differences. So what I just think a part of it is coming from, and I test this. I don't think I don't have the graph or the table to show it, but I went back and tested for just like trust in school board, in like school officials, and the folks of color were less likely expressing lower levels of trust in these school officials. And so when they're presented with this, well, they're not presented with the option because it's through random assignment, but when they're shown this decision being made by school officials versus the people in the group who are being shown an opportunity to directly make it themselves, I think that distrust factors in as to why the folks who got that direct vote treatment, where the folks of color in particular were just more responsive to that option than the folks of color who got the school officials decide treatment. So again, I think it's just like elite distrust that's motivating that. In terms of the treatment, the school board meeting flyer treatment and representation, great question. Actually, one of the reasons why I decided to do a flyer treatment design was because the previous study that was a big weakness, which is that, I'm oversampling for folks of color, but then I'm not showing you a very diverse school board in these meetings. And part of that is kind of a limitation of the design. Again, in the first study, I'm leveraging the fact that I found the school board that institutionalized response to public comment in their meetings, and I'm leveraging that. And so I don't have control over their racial demographics or gender demographic or any of the sort of demographic makeup. But with the flyer, I had a little bit more control, and I specifically targeted a school board that was racially and ethnically mixed, more and diverse, and the fact that I see pretty consistent findings from the first study to this flyer experiment, I think lends itself to the representation does matter quite a bit. And I think if there's a reason why I got the willing to actually raise a concern finding in the second study, but not the first study, I think it might be because of the representation idea that you're getting at. But that's still just kind of just what I'm guessing. And I'll have to do some more testing to fully definitively have an answer for that.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Cadence.
Another hand raised from Dylan Chittick.
Hello. Hi. Dr. Collins, nice to meet you. I'm Dylan. I had a question about you had a lot of varying factors, and I want to know, what did you do to keep control of them? And also, in one of my classes, I'm learning that like causality doesn't equal, like just because something is correlation doesn't mean like it's a cause of it. So how did you like find the, like make sure that what you were looking for is correct and what you find is correct?
Sure, no, that's a great question. And so I think a way that I'll kind of make this practical is that, so think about the differences between, for instance, when I initially show you the variation in the responses or the factors that seem to be correlated with the variation in the responses to schools reopening or closing. Remember, I used the open-ended question and I just asked people like, hey, what do you think about schools reopening? And then I'm coding for that. And then I show you model estimates that are based off of factors. So here, like for instance, in that model, the respondents of color were more likely to express opposition towards schools reopening, right? And this goes straight to your point that is not a causal claim, right? Them being identifying as Black or Latinx or Asian American, this in and of itself is not causing them to identify or to prefer the schools remain closed. What it is it's just that, it's a correlation. But what I'm doing with the treatments is trying to establish causality, because here with the treatments, it's the random assignment that is supposed to be doing the work of essentially rooting out all of those other sort of competing causes that might limit this from being causal and make it purely correlation. So if everything else is equal and the only thing that is different is the group that you've been randomly assigned into, this gives me confidence that the actual results post-treatment are in and of themselves rooted in the effect of the treatment. And I can say that exposing you to this caused you to think that. But even that, it depends on the tightness of the experimental design. So it's still not a sort of a perfect science, but that's at least the idea of why I'm using all of these different sort of treatment designs as opposed to even just kind of relying on cross-sectional responses. But thank you.
Question, hand raised from Kate Foster.
Oh, hi, thanks so much. This is a question that zeroes in on the federalism part and the locus of authority question. And I get to ask this and out myself as the president of the college, because it's been my observation in the COVID era that the decision-making has become highly decentralized, even questioning what the word authority means, because of course, none of us are epidemiologists. And no one wants to make this decision about opening schools or opening classrooms. So the CDC doesn't make the decision, the president doesn't make the decision, the governor doesn't make the decision, the NCAA doesn't make the decision, and they leave it to all of us as amateurs to figure out what's the decision. So my question is one of observation of whether you're seeing that, but what I think it's led to in K through 12 is sort of this two-part decision, right? You've got the the school board, let's say, decides whether it's going to open or not, or some group does, whether it's the governor or the mayor or the school board, somebody decides it's going to open or not. And then the parents, as a second layer of authority, decide whether they will in fact send their children to school. And the analogous situation with colleges and universities, which are in the exact same boat of not exactly knowing what to do because we're not scientists, let's say in this area, is that you say to the faculty, do you want to come back into the classroom? And then once that decision is on the table or some data are on the table, then the students then make the decision, do I want to come back to school too? Or maybe there's a parent involvement there. So all this to say, partly in a care to comment kind of question, but whether there's something different going on with authority, literally the decision-making, because it's the COVID era and because there's such uncertainty and no one really knows exactly how to handle what would ordinarily be maybe a pretty data-driven or a decision that we somehow feel some confidence in because we've made the decision, like it's a snow day decision. Do you open, do you close? So I'm curious whether there's something that's so unique about the COVID experience, or so rare, I guess, or challenging now, that you're imagining how this might have fit into all of the work that you're getting. And by the way, I thought the work was really fascinating. So congratulations.
Thank you, President Foster. An honor to just have you in attendance and to ask such amazing questions. And so what I'll say about that too is that I think your intuition is correct, especially the intuition about just like the dynamics of people's expectations for decision making changing. So I did a few tests just in terms of like, who do you trust? Who are you trusting more right now to make decisions? And trust in public health officials was extremely high. It was higher than religious leaders. It was higher than government officials. It was higher than like local community leaders, school leaders. Trust in the public health community is it is at an extreme high. And I think what that is also doing is that I think it's a bit zero sum. It's not totally zero sum, but I think there is a dimension where it's kind of becoming zero sum, whereas the more and more trust that's being given to the public health community, as it should, the more and more distrust there is of whether it's a district official, whether it's a college president who has to make a decision, whether it's a school district superintendent who has to make a decision. And and then those things are being heavily scrutinized. And then you have the federalism problem kind of interacting with the politicization problem, which is that people are just kind of also following cues when it comes to how they feel about this. So I trust public health officials supremely over other forms of leaders, but then I'm also a Democrat, and then I'm taking cues from Democratic leadership, or I'm a Republican and I'm taking cues from Republican leadership, or I'm a conservative and I'm reading conservative blogs and listening to conservative radio. And this is also sort of putting up, this is also sort of tinting my view of how I'm seeing these decision-making processes as well. And this came up in the open-ended responses. Some people were kind of like verbatim providing their view on schools reopening in a way that was pretty consistent with the way that like both liberal and conservative media had been talking about the COVID-19 dilemma, almost verbatim. So for instance, there was a sizable herd immunity group in the open-ended responses, people that thought that kids can't get COVID-19, people who thought that you can't get COVID-19 twice. I mean, so like there was a lot of information that was circulating, and when you tie it to their sort of political ideology, it's a pretty seamless connection there. And so I think it's those two levels that are competing. We don't really know who we trust to make the decisions, and we're willing to scrutinize anyone who steps in, and therefore all the leaders you're incentivized to sort of kick the can down the road. But then on the other end, it's like, well, people are really forming their opinions, not really based totally off of the information. It's really, it seems like it's more based off of just where they sort of are politically and ideologically. And it just makes a really, really difficult decision-making environment.
Yeah, thank you. That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. First from Jeanette Gomez. I know the survey is nationally representative, but I'm curious about how the survey responses would look in paying particular attention to rural areas, knowing that there seems to be internet issues and many school districts tend to be extremely small. It would be interesting to see what perceptions of engagement look like there.
I mean, that's a great question. And also, I want to give a special thank you to Jeanette. She is my research assistant and helped me do a lot in terms of organizing this actual data set. And she's like terrific. She's an MA student at Brown in our Urban Education Master's Program. And she is going to be a rock star, I think, in the academic world. So I'm really excited for her in her future. Great question too. The question about rural access is a really painful question, I think, for social scientists right now, because you think about like some of the polling errors that we've been seeing in previous elections that have created questions around our sampling mechanisms and whether or not we're really reaching everyone we need to reach in our surveys. And I think this is a question that I even would have with some of the data collection efforts that I've been doing, is like, are we really reaching the people who don't have internet access, who live in like rural areas, who live in areas that just are a little bit more off the grid? And to the extent that we are, though, and I believe that we are, again, this is where I put more weight on the treatments and the experimental designs, because sort of regardless of sort of where you are spatially, the randomization should account for that. And what I'm seeing is pretty consistently, and I think regardless of sort of where you are spatially, where you are in terms of state and location, where you are politically, and also just in terms of just like social identity, these treatments seem to be working. And it gives me the belief that even if I'm undersampling rural people, and even if the people who are included in the sample as rural folks aren't the typical rural respondents who might struggle to have like reliable internet access, that at least there's enough information that I'm generating through the experimental designs that gives me confidence that there is a there. I guess that's the sort of way to say it.
Great. A question from Matthew Bradley. Has your study been conducted, or do you plan to conduct your study throughout multiple areas of the country? By doing this, could we see how the local politics of particular areas could affect individuals' ability or want to interact or not in the school board meetings?
That's a great question. So what I'm trying to do is actually pilot a study in Providence that will look at this specifically in the city at a local level. But ultimately, I'd love to kind of do a little bit of, I don't know if you all have read Arlie Hochschild's work, as she's a sociologist at UC Berkeley. And she wrote this really cool book. She just like went to like rural Louisiana and just lived for like a few years and just like really got to know people and wrote about just like how people were forming their political identity and really dealing sort of politically with the environmental crisis. And I think we need more information on like folks who are living in these different sort of geographically, sort of spatially spatial sort of margin areas, communities, but especially like the diverse ones too, like because there are a lot of like really politically and racially and ethnically diverse communities that exist on the margins in like smaller rural areas that we just don't know enough about. And I'd love to eventually, take this idea and really kind of drop it in some of these places that are extremely understudied.
Looks like we have a hand raised. Bin Cho.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing this really fascinating research with us today. I'm Bin Cho, I'm a member of the Political Science Department. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the generalizability of the experimental results from the Lucid survey. I noticed that you conducted the survey during late July, early August. If I remember back then, tensions were very high. So if you did the result at an experiment, say today or another period, I was wondering how you think the results might, say, change.
Ben, that's a great question. That's the thing that I really want to know. And so, and I think the biggest variable that has changed since I've collected the data for the second study is the election. Is this kind of like this weird potential transition, right, between Trump and Biden. I mean, it's like it's a really unprecedented sort of political time where there is such heightened partisan conflict. And given that like partisan differences play such a big role in how people were reacting to the idea of schools reopening or closing, I would imagine that this partisan conflict would surface and become extremely not even just salient. I wouldn't be surprised if it really kind of sort of dominated the results and really took away some of the other dimensions that seem to be having an impact. So yeah, that would be my guess. It's extremely stringent political competition happening right now, and I think that would manifest into the results in the second rendition.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Other questions? Jonathan, I have a quick question if nobody else has one.
Sure.
Unless I missed it, in a lot of the models that you had, at least I think the first 6 or 7 of them anyway, unless I missed it, one of the things that seems to remain steady is that the belief in the ability to impact decision-making seems to remain low. How would you interpret that? What do you think that means?
That's a that's an interesting one, and I think it kind of ties back to to the discussion with President Foster, in that I think normally distrust, normally low levels of efficacy, I think is tied to, you could think of usually like maybe feedback loops or your own kind of just like personal experience with government. So people who have had negative experiences with government or haven't been mobilized and haven't had much contact with government or political candidates tend to be the ones who are sort of less efficacious. But I think COVID-19 has created this environment where it's different. And maybe it's interacting with that, but I really think that people, especially at this period when I'm collecting this data, are just so unsure in terms of what we know about the virus, that not only did people not necessarily feel like they had an impact on policy, I'm not quite sure that they wanted to have an impact on policy. I think that they just wanted to make sure that policymakers are listening to the people who have the most accurate and up-to-date information, but they themselves didn't necessarily want to control policy. The only evidence I even find of that was, again, like the direct vote versus district officials school reopening decision. And it's, if you think about it in the sense of the same groups that were like the same folks that were in the group who were supportive of a direct vote were also the same folks who were just like more skeptical of reopening. You get the sense of where that direct vote was going to lead. And so is it even efficacy as much as it, look, I know I don't want schools open, and I'm going to take advantage of a potential mechanism to ensure that schools don't open. And not necessarily I want to have some sort of say over policy. I'm just reading the tea leaves of what Fauci and public health experts are saying. And then I want to use this mechanism as a way to just kind of follow suit with that. And I think that, again, is just this thing that makes it different. It's a thing that makes, I think, again, like COVID-19 kind of a unique time in terms of policymaking, impact on policy, partisan politics, all of these things, the racialization of policy and politics. I think all these things are kind of different right now with COVID, and we're still making sense of it.
Okay, thank you. Looks like we do have another question in the Q&A. An anonymous attendee asks, are immigrants represented in this survey? I know your first study looks at a school board in Southern California, and immigrant populations are large there. In talking about trust, there is literature that suggests immigrant parents, for one reason or another, tend to believe that professionals such as principals and board members know what is best for kids. Has the study potentially addressed immigrant voice around reopening schools, for example?
That's a great question. And I don't have a direct answer to that question based off of my findings, but my answer is more so based off of some of the other studies that I've read kind of around this. And immigrant communities do a great job of organizing, especially parent organizing around schools. And so I didn't get into citizenship in the study just because I kind of go back and forth on including a citizenship question, because it could be something that really that could deter people from like participating, and rightfully so, because do you really trust some researcher you've never met with this kind of, which is really, really vital information? I mean, we have a census question, a citizenship question on the census, which was extremely politicized. And so like, do you really trust like this random researcher person at some university to be sort of like, responsible for that information? I don't blame you if you don't. And so therefore I don't add that dimension into the actual sort of research design. But it's something that I would love to do a specialized study that looks exclusively at immigrant communities and how they respond to these opportunities. And so I don't know if, sort of when I'll, get the opportunity to do that study, but it's like one of the things on the list of, once I can establish the idea that this sort of, the simple idea of school board meeting structure matters, now we can begin to think about under what conditions and under with specific populations do we expect this to work particularly well. And honestly, from everything that I've read about political organizing in immigrant communities, especially around education, I think it's going to work really well there.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we've gone through all of our questions. And it is 1:50, which means that our time is up. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your research with us. This was wonderful.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome, and thank you all for attending. This again was our final Politics Forum event of the semester. Please be on the lookout for more programming this February in spring of 2021. Thank you again for coming. Please stay safe.